Okay, so today's conversation, we're going to be talking about caffeine, contentious subject, how this fits into our view of health, what we've done in the past, what we're currently doing. Um, from a carnivore point of view, caffeine comes from a dreaded plant. So if we to think top level, why are we actually cutting out plants in the first place? Um, Potentially, some of them have high sugar or carb content. Not really an issue with coffee. Then the bigger issues that probably affect coffee are potential anti-nutrients, so plant compounds that we don't find in animal products that are detrimental to our health. Then there's other chemicals that could be specific to coffee. We'll get into those a little bit. Caffeine itself. Um, Generally, I think we like to come at things from this evolutionary perspective, which I think is a very useful place to start, but it does have some drawbacks. Firstly, it's impossible for us to know exactly what people have done in the past, though we can take a reasonable guess, but we'll never know fully what people have done, and we don't fully know what the health status was for them.
Yeah,
Even if we did figure all of that out, it's unlikely we can recreate that scenario now in the modern world. So some of those foods that we used to eat are no longer available to us. But we do perhaps have some novel new foods which may have advantages or disadvantages. Um, so trying to recreate the past isn't the goal here. It's just a guiding point to get us started. Um, at one point, humans didn't cook. At a certain point in our evolution, we started cooking. And arguably, that's an innovation that's allowed us to extract more nutrients from food. So it's possible that there's more innovations. Is caffeine an innovation that's giving us some benefits, or are we just kidding ourselves? So that's my setup. What are your opening thoughts on the evil brew?
yeah, I love it. That's the first one. I really do like coffee. It has been a massive part of my life, more so from when I first went to university. Mum and Dad drank instant coffee. Nescafe was their poison of choice way back when in the 70s. Um, I didn't drink it then, but then we had a free coffee machine of some really quite shite stuff at university. But it was free, and with milk and sugar, it did its job. Not sure what its job was actually. I got totally, I didn't realize hooked on it. I came home from the summer holidays and I would not drink it because I didn't really drink it at home. And I got these massive headaches, didn't understand why. So I knew, well, there's something quite right. And that's when I found out about caffeine's addictive qualities. So in terms of my, what do I think of it? I think it's addictive. So that's something I don't like. I don't want to be beholden to something that is addictive. Just don't like the idea of it. And I am someone who gets quite easily hooked on things. So I do need to be careful with that. There are, from my reading, a hell of a lot of potential benefits, which I think you'll go into in a bit more detail. But focus and attention for me seems to be one. That idea of getting up in the morning, having your coffee, getting you going. But I wonder, my experiences tend to show that actually that ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once you drink the coffee, you then need the coffee. Um, that's sort of, I can expand on that later maybe, but that's my initial thoughts. I love the idea of a coffee shop. Yeah, that's my ideal. A lot of my time on holiday I spend in coffee shops. A lot of time here I go to coffee shops to do work. I like that idea. But what I've read, I think specifically in Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, and about the potential effects of caffeine and the half-life of caffeine and how that would be affecting my sleep. Might explain why it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the thought that my sleep and that time of physical regeneration is being compromised plays with my background with having had cancer, lots of physical injuries and things like that, and wanting to be athletic and healthy going forward. I wonder what role that does play. But yeah, mate, what about yourself?
Yeah, okay. Where I am with coffee now, it's been a love-hate thing with me for years. I think I started drinking it at maybe late teens, 18, 19, something like that, probably because it seemed like a grown-up drink. So
Yeah,
I'd drink a massive mug of strong black coffee, probably instant with some sugars in there. And yeah, it seemed like an adult thing to do, and didn't really notice any effects of it, particularly when I was younger. I could have a cup of coffee and fall asleep half an hour later, no big deal. Then at a certain point, probably around 30s, when I was developing food intolerances, like it was my new hobby to become intolerant to anything you can possibly think of, coffee was added to that list in a different way to perhaps something like gluten, which can have an obvious effect on your digestion. I just found that I had a really low tolerance for it. I started to feel really wired from it, even a single cup. But we're going back to the time where coffee shops, as you mentioned, they were becoming more of a thing around then. So it probably was different going from drinking an occasional cup of instant to drinking the rocket fuel that they serve up in some of these coffee shops, where
yeah,
in some coffee shops they take the attitude that, stronger is better. Fine if that's what you want. So I think going to these stronger doses that I was having in coffee shops, and maybe some health issues that were going on with fatigue from work, I found that I just couldn't tolerate it. But like yourself, I still really enjoyed the ritual of a cup of coffee, especially on holiday, as you said.
yeah,
I've had a lot of holidays to the Mediterranean, and it seems like sitting in a cafe at around 10 or 11 and watching the world go by, having a cup of coffee is a big part of the enjoyment of
yeah,
that type of experience. And if you can replicate a bit of that in your everyday life at home, go to a nice coffee shop occasionally and have a bit of time to yourself or with some company, that seems like a good way to spend a bit of your life. So there's the ritual aspect to it. I'd also really got into making it. I was into particular types of beans. I was into the bulletproof coffee thing, which we'll probably discuss a bit more
yeah,
in a minute. So there's the whole process of making a coffee. Sometimes it would take a little bit too long. Might be spending 20 minutes, 30 minutes making this really fancy cup of coffee when I probably should have been doing some work. But yeah, it's nice to have those rituals in the day if you can. So it was about more than the effects of the coffee itself. And in terms of the effects of caffeine, I actually didn't really enjoy that much. I switched to drinking decaf coffee because I didn't really like the feeling of being wired. I didn't really feel that I needed an energy boost very often. Although I'd say occasionally it was useful for training. If you're doing martial arts training or something like that and you want to concentrate mentally and have physical energy, yeah, there's arguably some benefit to a little caffeine. But I got a little tired of the effects of caffeine after a while, so I'd switched to decaf. And where I am now is I drink it a lot less frequently. I'll drink an occasional cup, good quality cup from a nice coffee shop. Although recently you did get me back into putting butter in my coffee, which was something I
yeah,
had given up after a serious phase of addiction.
yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because that might sound like complete madness to some people. Why on earth would people put butter in their coffee?
Yeah. Well, I think like you mentioned bulletproof coffee. That's how I first came across that idea. Dave Asprey's work. Uh, I like the everything that Dave Asprey represented at the time, although I sort of see it slightly differently now. But it was that, this bulletproof coffee. He talked about the Tibetan goat herders and what they would use for energy and stuff, and this was all part of this cleaner diet. Of course, you needed to buy his coffee because of the molds that he claims that are on all these coffee beans, etc. I think we're going to touch on that later. I didn't. I tried it with the MCT oil and coconut. I didn't really like it, but with butter, it's actually a little bit like cream. And what I did find was, when I, again, like you, I've switched to decaf at the moment. But what I was finding is, because I sometimes have squash clients first thing in the morning, and stuff like that, I can end up having 2-3 clients, and I don't want to have breakfast before going on a squash court, and I tend to eat a bit later anyway. But I was finding that I was getting the cold hands, cold feet from like maybe a stress response to no food, almost too much the time. And actually, I've just played around with, like, other sports people will do with the carb gels. I said, well, I'm not going to have a carb gel. I'm going to have a coffee with butter in. I had only had salted butter at the time, and on its own, I didn't really like that. But with a smidgen of honey in, it becomes very nice. So I guess this sort of potentially breaks all the keto rules, but it was just very nice. And it did actually seem to keep my energy levels up, and I could get through those squash games. And in fact, I can even go through to an evening game without having eaten, but maybe just add a couple of butter coffees, sorry. And I can play a full on competitive match of squash, no problem, without any solid food during the day. Maybe 60 to 80 grams of butter through the day, which is still a significant calorie load.
Yeah.
And it was nice. The thing, it just tasted really nice. Even more so with the decaf coffee from Sainsbury's that you chose for me when I came down to see you.
It's a good combo, isn't it?
Yeah, it was lovely.
Let's talk butter and honey and why we're putting these things in. So you mentioned Dave Asprey, and he was the reason I started drinking butter coffee a long time ago as well. So you mentioned mycotoxins that could exist in coffee. We'll get into that in a little bit. But why butter instead of milk or cream? So as part of his recommendations, he's not a fan of lactose. So if you're having a big latte, there could be potentially quite a bit of milk sugar in there. And if you're trying to do a lower carb diet, that could be a fairly significant amount. So cream is essentially butter is essentially solidified cream. So really all you're doing is putting cream in your coffee and then typically using a blender to froth it up so it comes out like a nice latte. It's not just lumps of butter floating in your coffee. Usually in the past when I was doing this, I'd use unsalted butter, and it was just coffee and butter. Dave Asprey recommended putting MCT oil in there for its energy-giving properties. I never fully bought that myself. The coffee and the butter was enough. And I was hooked for a while wherever I went because I was working in lots of different locations at the time. I went there with full coffee making equipment and a blender to make my coffee at the allotted time. So a morning without it was no morning at all. The reason for the butter was basically as a replacement for cream, and that you can kind of froth it up and not have or a replacement for milk rather, and not have the lactose. When you came recently, you used salted butter, which I thought this is not going to work. Add that honey to it, and it's a whole different ball game.
Yeah,
so it's like a sort
bit like
of
the
salted
caramel side thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So in terms of how that feels as well, energy wise, when I was drinking the decaf coffee with butter in it, I was drinking it because I enjoyed it, and I can't honestly say that it gave me a great deal of energy. It probably staved off hunger a little bit, but the fat and honey combination actually felt a little better.
Hmm.
You said a smidgen of honey. I think you're quite generous
Well,
with the
yeah,
smidgens of
maybe
honey.
up. I'm gonna yeah, probably up to 2 teaspoons. I'm trying to.
Mm,
That's what I try and do. It's a squeeze, so I
yeah.
don't measure it out. It's to
Mm,
taste, and it's like, and I've just like timed the
mm,
squeeze, and then
yeah.
add a little extra.
Yeah. So that was a good combo. I've resisted the temptation to get back into that daily. I'm still looking at it as an occasional treat,
Yeah,
but as a way of getting through a morning, if you don't have time for solid food, makes some sense. It's enjoyable. It's giving you some energy.
I think as well, and this maybe comes from the Ray Peat school of thinking, and I know some of these can be oppositional in their approach, but I think your levels of stress across the board. I think we had a conversation the other day about how we pictured it as a graphic equalizer, and you might have temperature stress, cold or hot. You might have relationship stress going on, all these different types of stresses in your life. And if you've got too many that are too high, doing another thing is what tips you over the edge. Now, fasting, intermittent fasting, is one of those stressors. If you add physical exercise into that as well, that's another stressor. And Ray Peat was all about minimizing stress because he worried about the effects on the thyroid hormone and the increased cortisol, adrenaline, everything else. And what I just did find was that actually, yeah, sometimes it it feels fine to drink my black decaf, or when I was drinking caffeinated coffee, my black, but other times it wasn't. And actually, with the butter and the honey, which are both fat and sugar, are both in the short term physical de-stressors. They're physiological, stress relievers because it's like replacing the energy. So Ray Peat was always an advocate of having your coffee, if you're going to have it, with cream and sugar, so that you blunt the extra cortisol response, etc. Now, I don't know from a physiological perspective. I'm not well trained enough to understand whether that's correct or not. But what I do know is that sometimes it feels more right to have that, and sometimes it feels right to have just the black coffee. And
I'd
so
agree. Mm.
this is much more, I think, something that both of us have talked about, that rather than following prescriptions the whole time, we can't micromanage our physiology and understand what the outcome of that is going to be in 20, 30 years' time, which is what we're both interested in: aging healthily, being athletic when we're older, and looking at ways of living to be able to recreate that. So I think a certain amount comes with actually listening to our body and what we need, but with the understanding that certain things, if you do that with processed foods, that's maybe not a great idea. If you do it with alcohol, it's maybe not a great idea. And I think with anything that has that addictive quality, that's why I'm not on the coffee at the moment, on the caffeine. It's like because of that addictiveness, and I feel that I get drawn into it and need it, and I don't have that choice. But with the decaf and the honey and the butter, there are days where I feel it's right, and there are days where it's not right. And that works better for me. It's like, it seems to it matches my idea of life better, and I don't have to do something every day for this to be the right thing.
Yeah, interesting what we said about the adding some kind of energy substrate, some fat or some sugar to coffee. When I was still drinking caffeinated coffee, and I was starting to feel like I wasn't really enjoying the effects of caffeine anymore. I can't remember where I came across this, but it was on some kind of health blog saying that actually adding some sugar will slightly blunt the effects of the caffeine. So I did
Yeah.
start adding a little sugar to my coffee, and I did feel a little less jittery from it. But eventually, I went over to decaf anyway. Um, I think the way I approach things is quite similar to yourself. With any dietary choice, I try to just be honest about how I feel
Mm,
shortly after having that food or that drink. And
yeah.
unfortunately for me, with coffee, it did just get to the stage where, if I'm honest, I feel worse. I get the energy boost from caffeine, or you get the nice flavour if you're just having decaffeinated. But either caffeinated or decaffeinated, if I give my honest assessment, most of the time afterwards, I'd just feel like I'd had something that I needed to get out of my system, and I'd want to drink more. It's quite common to have increased thirst and increased urination because it's a diuretic. But I also just have that feeling a lot of the time, not all the time, that I'd had something a little bit dirty that should probably just flush out of my system. Now, there are certain coffees which I think are better than others. So, that's probably could be an individual thing. You mentioned that one that we bought recently when you were staying. Not too many adverse effects from that. There's certain coffee shops that I know I can go to where I feel fine after I have their coffee. There's other ones that I go to and think I always get a little bit of a headache after I have their drinks.
Right.
So if I'm being honest with myself, most of the time it's a no. So it's just an occasional thing now that I have for enjoyment. How are you looking at that yourself? Do you notice any adverse effects from caffeinated or decaffeinated?
So up until I think the first time I really tried to go caffeine free was during lockdown and the months leading up to lockdown, because I was like looking very much at like circadian living, trying to get the most out of my body through aligning myself with the daily rhythms of my body and the sunlight and nighttime. And what I found after I managed to wean myself off coffee, and I've got quite good at weaning myself off. I've tried it a few times now, and I've like a quite straightforward protocol of just basically starting off with, I was having coffees with 3 heat teaspoons of caffeinated ground coffee. I would then just substitute in a teaspoon of decaf and gradually build that up to 3 teaspoons of decaf over about the course of a week. And I could get away with not getting the headaches from doing that. But what I found when I did get to being caffeine free was that my energy was much, much better. And getting up, getting my early morning daylight, early morning exercise, doing all of that, getting daylight throughout the day where possible, which was easier given during lockdown it was easy. Just go out in the garden. I understand it's difficult for people working inside and offices and stuff like that, and I work on a squash court now, so it is more difficult. But I just found I could be sharper, more focused, feel better with no adverse effects for longer. And just really enjoyed the experience of waking up and feeling energized, which tends to tell me that my sleep was better. And so I came off that, started Carnivore last year. I went caffeine free again on the back of listening to Anthony Chaffee, and doing it with Carnivore was really interesting, because then I started noticing more effects. Because on Carnivore caffeine free, I was buzzing all day long, absolutely buzzing. I don't know whether that was just the novelty of it all, but mum and dad basically went ketogenic on the basis of what they saw in me. I then in September, I had a whole host of assignments and stuff I need to do for my level 3 squash coaching stuff. And I just felt under pressure, and I thought, right, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to have my coffee. I'm just going to blast through this week of getting these assignments done. And I did it, and I got them all done, and it was great having the coffee, but it's almost like I needed to do it. And then I just felt a little bit run down. But I ended up being on coffee until probably March, April time, and I had a whole string of colds from Christmas on. Christmas, I introduced a few other things. I slackened off Carnivore a little bit. I tried a few chocolates, a little bit of alcohol and stuff. And then I just couldn't get rid of these colds. And the only thing I could think of at the end was, actually, is the amount of coffee I'm drinking stopping me from recovering? Is it keeping me in fight or flight nervous system mode for too long? Is it interfering with my sleep and my ability to recover? And so, yeah, I came off coffee again, and within 2 weeks, the cold stopped. And yeah, I don't need it. I'm drinking
That's
decaf.
interesting.
Yeah. The other thing I noticed last year was the cramping with caffeine. Now, it's something that Chafee talked about. Muscle soreness as well from sport. That's one thing I did find with Carnivore, that my aches and pains, joint pain, muscle pain, all of that disappeared overnight almost, which was interesting. And I don't know whether that's placebo effect, but definitely I can walk down the stairs after a game of squash. And this happened before I'd lost the weight as well. So it wasn't just down to the weight loss. But I definitely, when I started on coffee again, I was waking up and getting cramp in my calves and shin muscles in the mornings. I'd stretch out, like, oh God, I've got to get out of bed, stand up on it, and every time I have coffee, that starts happening. Now, I think they talk about that it potentially blocks the absorption of magnesium. The magnesium is important for all sorts. Now you can supplement with it, but that sort of you're blocking something, so then you supplement with it. And I didn't want to spend any more money. I don't really trust. It's not that I don't trust that people are putting the right stuff in their supplements, but I've just seen some really wild laboratory reports on levels of different amounts in supplements, and they're not regulated in the same way as the drugs industry. So it didn't make sense to say, well, carry on drinking caffeine, but then have to supplement with something else just so that I can avoid the cramping. Cut the caffeine out, the cramping stopped, and my muscle soreness was, negligible. I have to push myself really, really hard to get sore muscles now, which is something I would agree with Chafee. I get tired muscles, but not sore muscles. So for me, in terms of when I look at my overall goal of life at the moment, which is to be as healthy and as athletic as I can be as I get older, but then also to share how I do that with other people, because I think we get accustomed to this idea that we're just going to age and become more and more decrepit as we age. And I hate that idea. I vehemently reject it. I get that that's what's happening in our day-to-day life, and we see it all around us, but I do not believe that it is inevitable. And so that's one of the reasons, that at the moment I don't think caffeine serves my longer term goals in that sense. And that says a lot coming from someone with ADHD, because it's very hard for me to have long term goals.
So to summarize, I think you experienced the thing that a lot of people talk about anecdotally when they start on Carnivore, is they have less aches and pains in general. But when you added coffee back in, you started to feel aches and pains, muscle cramping, and you also had that phase where you were getting colds and that sort of thing. Obviously, this is one story. It's not conclusive evidence, but that's your experience. And having cut out the coffee again, you feel you're back to where you were in the early stages of Carnivore.
Yeah.
So, there are a lot of people within the Carnivore world who do talk about this benefit of reduced aches and pains. And Dr. Anthony Chafee has brought this up. Again, it's all just anecdotes, but those people who try and do Carnivore with coffee not getting that benefit. So it's something interesting to think about. We can't really prove it. There's no studies on this, but be your own laboratory, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the message for me, from me and for myself, is be honest with it. Go look past the short term effect. It's the same with alcohol for me. Is some of my best friends through life. I've just been to a 25th wedding anniversary from guys I met 30 years ago in university and stuff like that. And our whole relationships were built around alcohol. But interestingly, there was a lot more alcohol-free drinks at the 25th wedding anniversary. I think we've all, through our own experience, realised that there's damaging effects to it. And whilst we like the process of drinking the alcohol, drinking the coffee, that actually it's not good for us in the long term. And for me, brain fogs, other stuff going on with the alcohol and with caffeine. I just wasn't feeling as good on a day-to-day basis, and that I felt I needed it. And that was how I rationalize that, how I understand that, is this idea of half-life of caffeine that I came across in Matthew Walker's book. Now, give or take, he suggests that the half-life of caffeine is 6 hours. Now, what does half-life mean? Half-life is the time it takes for the amount in your body to reduce by half. It comes from radioactivity, I think, the half-life of a radioactive substance. So it could be seconds, in which case it gets to almost zero very, very quickly, or it could be years in terms of radioactive stuff. So something could be radioactive Chernobyl, could be radioactive for a long, long time. Caffeine, the half-life of caffeine in our body suggests an average figure that we can look at, 6 hours. Well, I sort of started doing the maths on that. What did that mean to me? I liked my Costa coffees or my Cafe Nero, 4 shots. People say, well, if you have coffee before lunchtime, you're fine. It's not going to affect your sleep. Well, if I have 4 shots at 10 o'clock, that's the equivalent of 2 shots at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's the equivalent of 1 shot at 10 o'clock at night. And it's the equivalent of half a shot at 4 o'clock in the morning. Why is that important? Well, what caffeine has been shown to affect in sleep is the phases of deep sleep, non-REM deep sleep. And we get the majority of that early on in our sleep cycles. So we have these sleep cycles, 4 or 5 through the night, but we predominantly go through the non-REM deep sleep. They're more powerful early doors in the first 2 or 3 cycles, and then we move more to the REM sleep. Well, that's the time. I'm taking half a shot of caffeine at 4 in the morning from having had 4 shots at 10 the previous morning. So that's definitely, from that half-life theory, affecting the ability of my non-REM sleep to do its job. And what does non-REM sleep do? Physical regeneration. It's where our body repairs itself. That's one of the major factors for me. So, if you're doing training, people talk about it as a training stimulant, it enhances training performance or physical performance, but you've got to recover from that training. So does it become counterproductive? It allows you to train harder, create more damage, but actually you can't recover from the damage because the caffeine is interfering with the time of night, the processes that happen to actually put in place that recovery and regeneration. And what I have found for myself is that I am far less injury prone, both on carnivore and caffeine free. Now, I can't pinpoint exactly what it is, but I am far less injury prone now than I have been in previous years. So I'm going to take it on faith at the moment from the experiences and the narrowing down that I've done, that for me, that's the right thing to do. Okay, 2 seconds. Okay, thanks, Mum. Sorry about that. Parents going out.
I think the half-life question is a really interesting one. So if the half-life is 6 hours, quarter life, therefore must be 12 hours. So if you have any caffeine during the day and you're awake roughly 12 hours of sleep, well, probably less than 12 hours, but it's almost impossible for there not to be some caffeine still in your system
Yeah.
as you're trying to sleep. So let's just argue the other side for a minute. Now, I know plenty of people who drink 2, 3, 4 cups of coffee a day, possibly coffee shop strong stuff, and say that they have no problem with sleep. They fall asleep as soon as they get into bed,
Yeah.
and say that they feel fine. So they're not perceiving any adverse effects of it. All I would say to them is to push back on that would be, well, if you did give it up for 30 days, I'd be interested to see how you feel there. You know, in the short term, you're going to have a little bit of withdrawal from it and not feel so great.
Yeah.
But if you cut it out for a month or did decaf for a month, I'd be interested to see how those people feel. But if you're not cognizant of any adverse effect, you're probably not going to take that step. But let's just think about that. So you're having 2 or 3 or maybe 4 cups of coffee per day. Why do you actually need that much? Is it purely just you like the taste, or to me it seems like you require some kind of energy boost 2 or 3 or 4
Yeah.
times a day to get through the day. So if you did try the 30 days without and you slept better, arguably you might not need those little boosts of energy during the day.
Yeah. I'd add to
If
that
you want
as
to say
sorry,
something
go
there,
on.
yeah, no,
Yeah, I was
carry
going
on.
to say, we say we don't have problems sleeping. Now, I didn't have all the time I've drunk coffee. I very rarely struggled to sleep. It was more in recent years. If I did have a late coffee, I would struggle, but I could have coffees through the day and it wouldn't be an issue. And all throughout my university life, it was never an issue. Getting to sleep has rarely been an issue for me. But there's an interesting concept in terms of what is the level of deep sleep you get. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of sleep trackers because I don't think they're accurate enough yet from what I've read. But it was an interesting idea that there's a quality of sleep, not just an amount of sleep. You know, everyone talks about 8 hours or not, but that's a general figure that's touted a lot. But nobody really talks about the quality of sleep, or there's less talk about it. So I know, for instance, in the warmer weather, my quality of sleep is worse. I'm more tired in the morning. I'm dehydrated in the morning. And yeah, Matthew Walker's book, it's a book not to be read lightly, because it scared the living daylights out of me, to be honest. And all the things that went wrong. You think, well, you just, and I realized that so many people have issues sleeping as well. It was one of the biggest problems when I worked at Bodyguard's personal training studio, was people couldn't sleep. But what I worked out for myself is that if I'm not sleeping properly, everything else I'm trying to do is it's like building a castle on sand, foundations of sand. It's not likely to work. You might get some improvement, but there'll be a price to pay later on. For me, it was life of injury, possibly as well some link to the cancer, not being able to recover, and there's a whole host of other things. I'm not pinpointing my cancer on coffee by any means, but it was part of a problem. Yeah, my ADHD suggests maybe I was self-medicating to get myself through the day. It allowed me to focus. But I found that I don't need it to focus now if I get other things right in my life, which is what I'm trying to do. And then something we touched on briefly was, what are people's perceptions of their own performance? There are studies to show that sleep-deprived people have a very poor perception of what their performance is. They think they're doing great, and actually they're not doing great. And so it's worth reading the book just to understand all of this and actually think, bugger, yeah, it is. It feels like I'm doing a good job, but I'm not doing a good job, and I can see it in other people around me. The multiple times of asking the same question, not remembering stuff, going back because you forgot something, and things like that. And of course, that happens to all of us some of the time, but some of us, it seems to be that's my day in, day out. So yeah, for me, again, it's a bit like Carnivore. I do see myself having coffee at some stage, but it's going to be hopefully just for a one-off or a two-off type thing. I don't trust myself yet to do what Ryan Doris talks about, of use it tactically for working hard and, you know, trying to get yourself into flow and stuff like that. Although that's something I might be tempted to try down the line. He talks about using theanine to reduce the jitteriness. But at the moment, I like the idea that I'm not addicted to it. And soda water's great. Decaf's great. I can drink my decaf. Yeah, sorry. That's...
Well, let's have a think about this idea of just taking some exogenous stimulant and it being completely benign. So caffeine is a stimulant. I'll just read a couple of little quotes to explain what's going on. So it works by blocking, this is from the Healthline website, which is a fairly mainstream, uncontroversial website. So from there it says, it works by blocking the effects of adenosine, a brain chemical that makes you feel tired. At the same time, it triggers the release of adrenaline, the fight or flight hormone associated with increased energy. So no big surprises there. It's blocking chemicals, neurotransmitters that make us feel tired, and it's boosting hormones that give us energy. So another quote is, the blockage of adenosine receptors indirectly affects the release of neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine, dopamine, acetylcholine, serotonin, glutamate, and gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA. Okay, an influx in these new neurotransmitters alters mood, memory, alertness, and cognitive function. So let's just have a think about that. You're taking something external, which is, in simple terms, tinkering with your neurotransmitters and hormones. Now, I think I got this expression from, perhaps it might have been from Tim Ferriss. He said that there's no such thing as a metabolic free lunch. So, in other words, if you're taking some kind of external, exogenous compound, food, drug, that is affecting your physiology, there has to be a rebound somewhere. You can't just increase things on one end of a scale and not have some kind of reaction at another. So I think it's perhaps a little simplistic to think you can just take something, you're going to get boosted energy, and there's not going to be any physiological cost to it.
Yeah. You mentioned that's quite a cocktail of neurotransmitters that get released, and one struck me. I was wondering whether that would be the case. Dopamine. So we've mentioned already that caffeine and coffee type stuff is addictive. Dopamine, it's something that, from an ADHD perspective, for me is really, really interesting, because a lot of our motivational stuff, our ability to go and do hard things, relies on good dopamine levels and healthy dopamine receptors to receive that dopamine. And if you're getting a free dopamine hit that's a cheap dopamine hit, social media, internet, porn, gambling, alcohol, and if you repeat that over and over within like a time frame, the ability of that dopamine to make you feel good gets worse and worse. So the pleasure goes down and down. The downside, the downturn in how you feel gets worse and worse. But your brain is getting rewired to get you back to that same source of dopamine because it was easy to get. Now, dopamine, it's my understanding of it, it's one of its roles is to give us an expectation of a reward and to give us that feeling of motivation to go and work towards that reward. Find some tracks, and you can see that they're maybe fairly fresh, half an hour. Go and do the 2-3 hour hunt that you're going to do to track those paw prints or whatever they are to get your dinner. work in the rain, the cold, the wind, and all of that to build your shelter. Sit down, fill in your tax return to make sure that you don't get taxed too much. You get all these tasks in everyday life, and this is why, it's cool. It's there to drive us. And I find when I engage in these activities that give me cheap dopamine bursts, and a lot of it is the research on YouTube for, videos that we look at. YouTube has its clickbait, and it's this same thing scrolling through, get an expectation. You're looking for the one thing that gives you that bit of a buzz. You look at it and you end up not being able to focus on anything for any length of time. And overall, your general enjoyment of life goes down. Life becomes boring. And I hear it a lot with a lot of the kids that I teach in the squash coaching. Anything longer than a YouTube short or an Instagram reel or anything is like, read a book. Don't be ridiculous. Watch 20 minutes. No, 20 minutes is too long. Stuff like that. And I could feel that happening with myself. And so with caffeine, I have read that caffeine can improve the number of dopamine receptors. So there's maybe a little bit of confusion there. Is it a net positive or a net negative from that motivational side of things? I'm not sure. But for me, for now, it's easier not to have it.
Just going to do a little sound check because we've got some construction work going on next door. Let me know if that's an issue, and
I can't hear anything this end.
All right. No. Okay. We decided at the beginning, before we went on there and started recording, how we were going to approach this. There's a ton of research out there on caffeine and its effects, good and bad. And we decided that we were going to give our own experiences rather than go through all of this research. It's a huge undertaking anyway, but I just want to highlight a few things that we've looked at. So the majority of the research that you'll find, I think, actually points to caffeine being pretty beneficial. If you look at these large population studies that have been done, there's quite a few. There's a large body of evidence that suggests that overall it's a net benefit. For example, there's research showing that all-cause mortality is reduced. There's some positive effects on the liver health in particular. That's the one where there seems to be the strongest effect. But without picking through all of this, nearly all of this research, or all of it that I can see, is epidemiology. So it's population studies. We're looking at correlations. And I think you also have to bear in mind the group of people, the type of people that the research is being done on. So most of it is probably in a general population. There probably isn't any caffeine research on a ketogenic community, for example, much less likely a carnivore community. If there is that research, it would be very small compared to the research that's done on a general population. Maybe there's something to that. You can, I think, have a look at some of the work of other people. I don't want to just repeat what other people are saying online. On the negative effects, there's a few specifics which we haven't really talked about in much detail yet. One of those is mould, which we brought up with the bulletproof coffee thing earlier on. This is the idea that coffee is likely to contain certain amounts of mould. Almost certainly it does in most cases. What we're talking about here is mycotoxins, not myco, which are very tiny amounts of mold toxins, specifically aflatoxin and ochratoxin. Now, these are known carcinogens. They're certainly in large enough amounts. They're very dangerous. I think the argument here is that in general, the amounts that you're exposed to in coffee are probably quite low. So I think this becomes a question of It's something that's known to be toxic. Are you okay with taking a very small amount of something very toxic regularly for the rest of your life? That's a really difficult one to answer. We don't know what the long-term effects are for certain. Although we know that these compounds are toxic, we don't really know what the effect is of consuming them in tiny amounts in coffee over a long, long period.
Yeah. And I think another thing Sean Baker mentions on one of his podcasts, videos on YouTube, is coffee harming your carnivore diet. He again says that, lots of beneficial stuff. Obviously, the cultural role it's played can potentially enhance brain function, alertness, focus, reduce fatigue during challenging physical activities. But then also talks about containing lectins and phytates that can cause digestive problems and inflammation. So again, I think it comes down to being honest with what's going on in your own body. And if you've got issues, it may be something that's worth trying to lose for a while and give it out. And I think that's, you and I have both come to the conclusions for many things around nutrition and movement through our own experimentation. And I think that's a really important thing. A study can tell you so much, and it can maybe give you a valuable starting point. But digestive problems are massive for everyone. I mean, that's one of the things has been your major bugbear. So I know so many people with digestive problems, but they just think they're normal. But they're not. Yeah, there can be life without digestive problems, although there are many things that you may have to fight through to try and find that. It's not a straightforward solution. It is for some people, but not for a lot of people.
Well, I think that really sums up what we're working to fight against, really, which is this sort of normalisation of ill health, of so many things that you look around at people around our age and they've just accepted. So you mentioned poor digestive health, being tired all the time, poor sleep, needing caffeine to get through the day, carrying a bit more weight, achy joints, middle-age spread. I'm 50, so I should have some extra pounds around the middle. That's just normal. I can't do this physically, can't do that physically. People are very accepting of these things because that's what they see around them. It's normalized. And that's really what we're trying to challenge. I'm coming up 50 in a couple of months, and I'm absolutely confident, I've said this before, that by 55 I'll be more athletic than I am at 50. And I intend to try and continue that trend forward as long as possible. And that might sound like a fantasy. It might just sound like I'm totally delusional, but there's so much unexplored training methodology. There's so much that we don't really know even about nutrition and other health practices. If I think back to when I was 25, and let's say, that's probably a time when a lot of people would think that they were at peak energy levels, perhaps. The amount of things I was doing wrong at that point, my diet was crappy. There's alcohol, poor sleep, all kinds of other factors. If you did some of those things right at age 50, you could arguably be at those same energy levels, or perhaps even higher. So that's what I'd want to encourage people to think about. It's just to challenge what they're seeing around them. There's some of the things that we do as well. It might sound really restrictive or a little bit puritanical. I'm going to give up coffee so I can be high performance. Not everything needs to be difficult. There are so many things I think that we do that are just small everyday things that don't really take up a lot of time, that you can integrate into your lifestyle that are very low effort, but over time just increase your energy levels. And I think this is what we're trying to get out to people as much as possible. Not everything has to be difficult. It's not all about a lifetime of restriction and punishing yourself in the gym to, break yourself down so you can come back stronger and all that nonsense. I'll get off my soapbox.
No, I'm with you on that soapbox, and I think you mentioned restriction, and yes, I do feel in some sense that certain things, it feels like, oh, well, I'm cutting out coffee, I'm cutting out carbs, plant foods, stuff like that. But it's sort of, I don't know, it was difficult to wrap my head around those ideas first off, and a few years ago, definitely. But there was a crunch point which we discussed about why I started Carnivore in terms of the weight and stuff like that. I don't miss being fat, overweight, obese, whatever the PC word is for it. Um, I could still be happy as a person. I could still be decent as a person with that physical condition, and I wasn't any lesser of a person, shall I say? I was more of a person in many regards. But what I do know, for me, my quality of life is better now than it was when I was overweight. My quality of life is better now, and so the things I'm doing for that, I'm not restricted by what I can do on a squash court now. Whereas I was restricted when I was 2-3 stone heavier. I still love my squash, but I couldn't play to the extent that I wanted to play. I'm not restricted by the fact that I need meal times. I can go a full day without food and not worry about it. There's no restriction there. I can do much more because of it. So yes, in the short term, it does seem like a real mental struggle. I'm not going to be able to do this. I can't have that. And it seems horrible. But when you get to a certain place, you start realizing the benefits, and that dopamine kicks in to make it easier to do all of these things, and you feel the benefits, and it's great. So yeah, I'm with you all the way on that soapbox there. But it's
I
hard.
think the freedoms that you gain outweigh the small inconvenience of drinking a few less coffees.
Yeah. So I mean, my heart's heart I had a heart issue from the chemo and possibly other stuff, and I've got an appointment, a telephone review for it next week. But the cardiologist wanted me to go on a blood pressure lowering program. Well, I did Carnivore. It's not what he wanted me to do, and it's not what the GP wanted me to do. But my blood pressure's come down, my waist size has come down, my resting heart rate has come down. It's like all the indicators that they would give to me of good health have improved. So I'm looking forward to my conversation with him next week. And so I don't need to take medications. So that to me is not a restriction. I really miss having to take medications. Yeah, it's not a restriction. It's not a restriction. I really miss being able to play 3 hours of squash in a day and not get injured. Oh, sorry, no, I really miss only being able to play an hour and then getting injured. Yeah, I don't miss that. So what I would say though is this isn't a journey that happens overnight. So I was chatting to someone who started meat based on what they've seen of me at the squash club, and he's gone full on. He's 40 odd, and he's lost a couple of stone already. Well, not a couple of stone. He's lost probably half a stone, but he's only been going a couple of weeks. He's full of energy, etc. But he's thrown himself into so much everything, and from my perspective, it's taken me 15 years since I first got diagnosed with cancer to move to a path and a place where I feel pretty confident with now. Could I shortcut that now? Yeah. And when I talk to people, there's a lot of mistakes I've learned from, and I can push people in, or guide people in a direction much, much quicker now. But there are a variety of areas to look at, not least of which is mindset, how we perceive things, our beliefs, all of that sort of stuff. And that's probably one of the biggest obstacles for a lot of us in terms of being able to try a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think what you've described there is important for people to think about. It's a perspective shift, isn't it? That the benefits that you will hopefully experience from this lifestyle and challenging your ideas ought to outweigh the small costs of making change. And making change is not necessarily easy. When we've been doing things for a long time a certain way, it can seem difficult to make changes to daily habits. But once you're on the other side and you're reaping those benefits, you tend to look back, I think, as you said, and have a better perspective on it. Is there anything else that we need to say about coffee? After all that talking about coffee, I feel like going and having one with a lot of butter and honey, in it.
Not about coffee, but just about what you said and what we've just touched on lately is that actually one thing that has really helped me is knowing that there are other people doing this stuff, and getting in touch with those people, knowing that other people for Carnivore, me joining Uncommon, finding other people on Carnivore was really interesting and great for me to give me that confidence. I've just been talking to one of the students working at the squash club. She said, "Oh, you do meat based? Oh, quite a lot of my friends are doing that." And I sort of asked what age group, and they were all young, teenage, early 20s, and they, I think this like the interest in these things. I think people can see that things have been going wrong a lot, but it is difficult to change if your tribe isn't doing what you want to do. So, but if you look and you search, there are people out there. We're happy to help with people, or if there's other people, there's a lot of people out there that are doing this stuff. It's not as weird as you think anymore. And if you want to live a good life and you want to grow old, fit, healthy, athletic, die in your sleep when you're 120, that's my dream. But go look for it. It will be there.
Okay, let's wrap it up there then, Mike.
Okay, will do. Till the next time.
Cheers, Mike. Bye-bye.